All right, I have a new Substack essay called Our Dying World Cities, and it was inspired by a sentence out of Spengler. The first time I encountered Spengler's book, Decline of the West, I remember I was an undergrad in the library, and I remember the one sentence that captured me and drew me right into the book. And it's in the back of Volume 1 where you unfold the charts, and there's one sentence there that says, primitive human conditions slowly thrust up through the highly civilized mode of living. And that caught my attention. And I thought, oh, that's weird. So at what point does this take place where cities disintegrate to such a point, even though they're in megalopolitan mode, which they are at the end phase of all of them. They all produce world cities. Mesopotamia, at the tail end of its civilization, produces Babylon. Our civilization has produced New York and Paris and Berlin. These are the kinds of world cities that come in at the end phase of a civilization. But Spengler's point is that slowly over time, nature reclaims the civilization, and it starts through this reversion back to primitive living conditions, like our tent cities that we see in Seattle right now. We'll get into that, but first, basically what I want to do in this video is just to promote the blog piece. I'll put my Substack link down in below, and I do still do private astrology readings. They're not free, so to keep that in mind. If you're interested, hit me up at my Gmail, and of course, Patreon subscriptions are always appreciated. They always help. So the essay starts, and I'll just do the setup here. I don't want to give the whole thing away because I want you to subscribe. But the setup has to do with the making of a distinction between two different types of world cities. Because as I see it, there are two types. And this goes back to ancient Mesopotamia, where we find the prototypes in the cities of Akkad on the one hand and Nippur on the other. I could have chosen any Sumerian city. Most of them fit this type. Where we get these two types, and the one type is strictly economic in its mentality, as Akkad was. And the other type has come into being organically, over time, tied in very closely with religious ideas and spiritual visions that give to cities immune systems. Now, I've spoken elsewhere about cultural immune systems. Entire civilizations, of course, have immune systems, and they can be weakened, as the pagan immune system, as I've said many times, was weakened by Theodosius the Great when he shut down all the pagan temples and basically made paganism illegal in 390 AD, and then in come Alaric, the leader of the Visigoths, by 411. That can't be an accident. He's weakened the entire civilization's immune system. But cities, too, also have, or can have, immune systems to varying degrees. And so if we take a look at these two prototypes for these two different types of city, let's look at Akkad. Sargon of Akkad dates from about 2334 BC. He ruled for 55 years in this city, and he is preceded by a man named Lugal-Zaghazi, who ruled for about 24 years. And the thing that is significant about these two individuals is that they correspond, in terms of Spengler's morphology, to the Napoleon-Alexander types. That is to say, these are the first types that appear, that begin to try to start unifying the various disparate nation states in Europe under Napoleon, or the various city-states in Greece under the Macedonian Alexander the Great. That process is the beginnings of the process of the formation of what will inevitably end up, when the Caesars do come, a couple of centuries after that, or let's say, about 2 centuries after that, when they form what can be called universal states, which is the final conclusion, as every one of these civilizations ends with the formation of an empire. But a Napoleon or Alexander type figure does appear as the first attempts at unification. And in both cases, Lugal-Zaghazi and Sargon of Akkad, they were attempts that had minimum degrees of success. Lugal-Zaghazi now was a Sumerian. So the whole thing about Mesopotamia is that it is made up of two different ethnicities. Sumerians on the one hand, and we're not sure, they're not Indo-Aryan, they're not Semites, they're just Sumerians. That's all we know about them. They just sort of emerge natively out of the land over eons. And then we have the Akkadians, which are the oldest and earliest Semites. Sumerians spoke the language of Sumerian. Akkadians spoke Akkadian. Sumerian gradually became like Latin. It died out. And the Babylonians, when they come in, and they represent, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of Spenglerian morphology, the Roman type mentality. The Babylonians are the Romans of this civilization, and Hammurabi the Great corresponds to Augustus Caesar. He's the first of the sort of Mesopotamian Caesars who rules, starting about 1790 BC, comes in. They start as Amorite barbarians, so they're an external barbarian war band that eventually picks up the language of Akkadian and becomes very sophisticated, and then they establish Babylon with their primary ruler, god Marduk, who is a symbol for the planet Jupiter, primary ruler. And so anyhow, going back to 2334, when Lugal-Zagesi, just before this, 24 years before this, has been the last Sumerian ruler before Sargon, and he attempts to unify the whole land. And he, as far as I can tell, he did this successfully and stayed in place, ruling over all the city-states, because the Sumerian Sumer begins about 3500 BC, and like with Greece, it's just a collection of independent city-states that are gradually going to war with each other more and more over things like water scarcity, issues like that, over resources and civil wars. The long civil war between Umma and Lagash is very similar to the civil war between Athens and Sparta. So eventually Lugal-Zagesi comes on stage, unifies all of this. He's a Sumerian, and then he's ousted by Sargon. So Sargon in 2334 then comes in, overturns him, and he is the real sort of Alexander figure that creates the empire for the, that says that from the island of Cyprus all the way down to the Persian Gulf, he unifies Mesopotamia for the first time as a universal state, and he rules for twice as long as Lugal-Zagesi, although he has sons, and then a great-grandson, or a grandson, who is a great figure named Naram-Sin, who's another great ruler. And then there's another ruler, I think Shirkali Shari, after him. And then after 150 years, Akkad is overrun by an external proletariat, a barbarian war band, namely the Gudians, who come in raiding down from the hinterlands, and they simply swarm over this city and wipe it out of existence so thoroughly that we've never found it. We have no remains of it. We know about where it should be located, north of Babylon, roughly somewhere in there, but nobody's ever found it. It's possible that Baghdad may be on top of it. That may be the reason why. So now the city of Akkad is the first city in the world to be founded by one man. So that's a first. So this comes in. Mesopotamia has been up and running by this point about 1,000 years. And one man comes in, Sargon. And he's, so far as I know, the first man in history to go, I'm going to create an entire city, let's do it. And keep in mind, this is 1,000 years now before the pharaoh Akhenaten in 1350 BC decides to do something similar and founding a much smaller scale city called Amarna. And that experiment only lasted for 13 years. It had similar problems in the distinction that I'm going to make here in a moment regarding axial cities versus economically driven cities. Akkad is the first city in the world not only to be founded by one man, so it didn't grow organically out of the Mesopotamian soil over millennia like a lot of these cities did. All of a sudden it's just there overnight, and it's the first of all of the Mesopotamian cities to have its economy based entirely on international trade. The alluvial plain is resource poor, no metals, no minerals, hardly any wood. You have to import all that stuff, jasper, carnelian, turquoise, all these precious resources for the building of civilization, except for the making of mud bricks. That can be done natively to build the architecture, but otherwise all that stuff has to be imported, metals and minerals and all kinds of stuff. And it was not based, and so it's the first Sumerian city to not be based on an irrigation agrarian economy. So, in other words, we have a city that is very shallow. It is not axially rooted. It did have temples to gods, because all of these cities did. This is the religious phase of civilization. But it was nonetheless sort of just sprung up out of the land overnight, based entirely on international trade. So it came into being for strictly economic reasons, and political, of course, with the unification, but nonetheless, it just didn't have a strong immune system, because it wasn't religion that brought it into being, and it wasn't a religious vision that brought it into being. So it had a very weak immune system, and I think this is the reason why the Gudian barbarians so easily, a mere swarm of barbarians come in 150 years after the city is founded and wipe it off the map. This is one type of city now, the economically driven type of city. Now the other type is best typified by the city of Nippur. I'm choosing that city because it was more or less the Vatican of Mesopotamia. It was the religious city par excellence, and no king could claim rulership over all the land without being crowned there. Kind of like the the Pope and the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. That he has to be crowned to get that religious legitimization from Nippur. So Nippur was continuously, more or less, as we'll see in a moment, occupied from 5000 BC, where it was a group of Abydians, villagers living in like Pueblo style, let's say, villages, 5000 BC, but the site was continuously occupied, except for a few catastrophes, all the way down to the time of the Ottoman Empire. So that's the 15th century. And what's there now on the site, that's when it devolved into what's there now, just reverted back to a bunch of villages, small-scale villages. And so Nippur went through a series of catastrophes, one of which took place where the Euphrates shifted its course, and it went west of the city, and they lost contact with their water supply. So the city had to be entirely abandoned, and this was in the time of Ibbi-Sin, the ruler Ibbi-Sin, at the end of the third dynasty of Ur, so that's about 2000 BC, roughly thereabouts, and then down to the time of the Babylonians, the Old Babylonian period. So by the Old Babylonian period, let's say 1720, the city is entirely abandoned because they can't get water to the city. But not entirely. There is still a contingent of priests who are going into the temples, making minimal offerings, and just leaving it. So they didn't entirely abandon it. And it wasn't until the Kassites came in, 1400 BC, the Kassites come in and they restore it, they rebuild it, they rebuild the temples to the gods Enlil and Inanna. Enlil was always the primary deity there, although temporarily when the Babylonians conquered the land, they put Marduk in place of Enlil. But then it eventually reverted back to Enlil. Enlil was always the primary god. Each one of these cities has its primary god, and Enlil was the primary god. And then so when the Mediterranean Dark Age hit, 1155 to 800 BC, that wiped everything out in the Eastern Mediterranean, it also caused a Dark Age, a Mesopotamian Dark Age. And so it knocked the city out yet again, Nippur. And then it was restored about 800 AD by the Assyrians came in. They restored it and began rebuilding all the temples, and it becomes a magnificent place once again. And then it just keeps doing this over time. During the Neo-Babylonian period, it falls into desuetude, and then it's revived with the Persians when they get there with the Achaemenid Empire, and they start rebuilding all the temples between 500 and 330 BC, and so forth, on and on. This is an indestructible city, in other words, because it is an axial city. So I'm making a distinction here in this essay between two different types of world cities. Axially rooted cities, or axial cities, which come into being because they have developed organically over time slowly and have come into being as the result of a religious vision. Jerusalem and Mecca are still there for a reason. They will survive just about any calamity because they are axially rooted. Now, cities which come into being based on one economy are doomed. Because once that economy shifts, as the economy of Akkad, which was internationally based, was disrupted by the Gudians, disrupting all their trade routes. Once the economy's gone, the city goes too. And most of the cities in America, I just want to point this out, I'll conclude here, but most of the cities in America were founded for strictly economic reasons. That's why they're dying. And so the rest of the essay develops these two prototypes and shows how they relate to what's going on today with our current dying world cities. So I'll put the link in at the bottom here, and I hope to see you on Substack.